Hey everybody, this is Isaiah and welcome back to Magic System Monday.
I'm so happy to see you again, bro.
That's right baby, we're back, and today I want to talk about the Force from Star Wars, more specifically the original trilogy. Now, as I'm sure you all know, there's a lot of different Star Wars out now, ranging across two separate canons, but what I want to do is, I want to go back to the very beginning. I want to look at just the first three movies, and find the Force in its purest, most original interpretation, and at the end of the video, I'll have my grading system as well as my final score for the Magic System, and without further ado, let's boogie. Isaiah, please never say that again.
Slam George Lucas's head in a car door for far more than just ruining Star Wars!
So, just to start off, what is the Force exactly? The Force is an energy field that surrounds the entire universe. It binds it together and permeates everything within it. It is both created and amplified by life. And a select few, who seem to be decided by their bloodline, have the uncanny ability to not only sense the Force, but control its flow in themselves and in the rest of the universe. In later additions to the timeline, these people are known as Force sensitives, and many of them go on to become Jedi. It rolls off the tongue in a pretty strange way, doesn't it? In fact, I know a lot of people who've completely forgotten that this is how it used to work. But nonetheless, it is true. At least for the most part, it seems to be dependent upon family line, which in this specific system is a tad bit odd, but never mind, we'll cover that later. Now, in any case, if you do have the Force, it gives you access to a number of psychic abilities, most of which falling into one of two camps with a couple of exceptions. The first would be mental powers, and the second would be telekinesis. Let's talk about the mental powers first, because there are technically just more of them, and I also consider this category to be the most important one, because most of the plot-relevant stuff falls into this category, with a few exceptions. Now, the first of the mental abilities I want to talk about are the Force senses, because the Force senses are the broadest category of all the Force abilities that you get. It is basically 85% of the Force, if not more. Now, naturally, because the Force surrounds and penetrates all things are connected and made one in the Force. And as a result, in theory, you can sense just about everything with the Force. Now, in case you were wondering, this is not a case of video essayist exaggeration, I promise. You can just about actually literally sense anything with the Force. Characters are not only able to sense their immediate vicinity, they're also able to sense the broader universe around them, as well as specifically fluctuations in the Force itself. Characters are able to use the Force to sense other characters who are strong in the Force. They're able to sense people's individual Force presences, so to speak. As in, you can sense the Force within a person to distinguish who it is, especially if you're familiar with them. You're also able to sense, at least to an extent, people's emotions. Whether they're angry, whether they're conflicted about something, etc., etc. Now, it is sort of implied that this is more difficult than just sensing physical things, but that's besides the point. Interestingly enough, though more difficult than sensing people's emotions, you're able to sense their thoughts to some degree as well. The interesting thing about this is the fact that there doesn't seem to be much you can do to combat it. While Obi-Wan Kenobi tells Luke to bury his thoughts, we don't have any proof of whether or not that your strength in the Force allows you to resist someone sensing your thoughts. Beyond that though, it seems to be a very difficult ability. Now, regardless of whether or not you're sensing physical things, whether they're around you or at a distance, whether they're people's emotions or thoughts, the neat thing is that these senses are not limited to the present time. Characters are able to sense both the past and the future. Now, to be fair, the future is, by the series' admission, always in motion. Just because you foresee something in the Force doesn't mean it's guaranteed to happen a specific way. However, it's worth noting that this disclaimer that's given by Yoda, depending on your interpretation, isn't necessarily worth that much. Because we see over the course of the second two movies that the Dark Lord is so strong in his sensory ability, his ability to sense people's emotions and to sense the future, and he's so good at putting that information into practice that he's basically convinced himself that he's powerful enough to decide the future for himself. And to be honest, I can't fault him for thinking this, because it's mostly true. Mostly. Now, the funny part about this is, you might perceive that to be a special quality that Palpatine has, maybe that he has a special skill on his own outside of the Force that allows him to be smart and manipulate things. and that's a very fair possibility, but it kind of doesn't matter because there's this little thing called Force guidance that inherently makes a person more competent by virtue of their power in the Force itself. However, we'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, obviously that doesn't mean that every Force user's senses are somehow infinite. In reality, the senses through the Force are actually a skill, just like any other, and by training with it and getting better at it, you can see more things. What exactly a Force user can see varies tremendously by not only their skill level, but whether or not they're intentionally paying attention. Now I say that because throughout the series we're made privy to the fact that a person's Force senses have both active and passive uses. That as a person grows strong in the Force, they're able to sense sort of innately, even though they can also hone in on their skills with the Force to try to sense things on purpose. For example, in the beginning, the way that Luke first trains utilizing Force guidance is by sort of extending out his unconscious senses to the world around him. But later in the story, we see several examples of characters, whether actively or passively, sensing various things in the Force outside of their immediate vicinity. For example, despite the fact that Obi-Wan wasn't there for the destruction of Alderaan, he was able to sense the disturbance in the Force regardless. And in the later installments, we're made privy to characters like Yoda and the Dark Lord. Yoda, interestingly enough, is so strong in the Force that he was basically able to spy on Luke his entire life. As crazy as it sounds, by his own admission, he says this. He watched Luke his entire life. Apparently, he just knows about him because he's just like that, which would directly imply that Force users have some kind of scrying ability. This is important because it's never portrayed as if the Force is like deliberately handing them pieces of information. No, the characters are just able to figure this relevant information out on their own. And while we're on that subject, I'd also like to add that it doesn't really seem as though the Force has a mind of its own in the original trilogy. I'm aware that some people would try to use the idea of the Force having its own mind as sort of an argument against many of the criticisms that I might make in this video. Having said that though, there's really not much information that we have to go off of to suggest that this would be the case, and if it was, it would make other parts of the story make less sense. So, ultimately, despite the fact that many of the characters have varying levels of skill in the Force, it seems that most of the relevant Force-using characters are capable of sensing uncanny amounts of information, and they're pretty much only limited by whatever the story says that they're not allowed to sense at that moment. To put this in plain English, I'm saying their key limiting factor is the plot. Now beyond that though, your ability to sense the flow of the Force is one of the most critical abilities that a Force user can have, not just because of all the senses that you get, but also because it's a prerequisite for most of the other Force abilities. For example, one of the other common Force abilities that you see characters using is Force guidance, which sounds similar, but upon examining these movies for literally 20-something years, I believe that this ability is worthy of being categorized on its own, despite being dependent upon Force senses. Now, interestingly enough, this is one of the first Force abilities we're made privy to. When Obi-Wan describes the Force, he describes it with an interesting duality. While you can control the Force also guides you, and it seems to have both a physical and mental effect that makes them overall much more competent. If the Force senses are the most powerful facet of the Force, then Force guidance is the second most powerful. If you had these two and you didn't have the telekinetic ability that the Force gives, the plot would darn near be the same. The reason I say this is because just having access to Force guidance, even as a beginner, makes a person so skilled and so competent at most of whatever they're doing that you usually don't need the telekinesis anyway. As an upstart Force user, only having recently learned how to use Force guidance, Luke was able to make the shot that destroyed the Death Star, and assuming that you're familiar with Star Wars, you know that the shot required to destroy the Death Star was an extremely precise one. You had to fire torpedoes along a very specific, very, very narrow path that was so narrow and the margin of error was so low that even advanced targeting systems that the X-Wing fighters had literally were not precise enough to perform that calculation. However, with the use of the Force, Luke was able to make that shot on his own, completely destroying the Death Star. Now, having said that though, it's worth noting that I don't really know how much natural talent a character has outside of the Force. While we know for sure that Luke has a number of talents of his own in the beginning of the story, it's difficult for me to determine whether or not these are passive, accidental uses of Force guidance, or if he actually has his own skills. Because we know Force guidance is a passive ability, and the story at least a little bit seems to be implying that even when you're not actively using Force guidance, you're subject to that guidance to some degree, sort of innately or automatically. Now, unto itself, this isn't the biggest issue usually, but it makes it difficult to distinguish any unique qualities that a person has outside of the Force, because anytime they do anything cool, significant, or skilled, it's very easy to just look at it and say, you know what? That was probably a Force feat as opposed to a natural talent. And if all of a character's feats are Force-based feats that are given to them through the Force, even if they work to get stronger in the Force, it kind of takes away from their individual nature. The idea that the Force is just going to give them whatever abilities that they need, outside of blatant magical capabilities. Especially when all Force-sensitive characters have it. Without the Force, some of these characters could just be bums for all I know. In a longer or more complicated story, this would have been a problem. And in this story specifically, while it isn't the biggest deal, I consider it to be abnormally convenient and kind of cheap. Now, the next Force ability is actually a tad bit of an outlier compared to the other mental abilities. And that would be what some refer to as the Jedi mind trick. The Jedi mind trick is made possible because the Force connects the minds of people and allows the Force user some limited degree of control over them. As a result, a skilled Force user can inject thoughts into people as if they were their own, which results in them acting out those thoughts or reacting to those thoughts and effectively controlling their actions. We've also seen Ben Kenobi use this to create temporary illusory distractions in stormtroopers, and while we don't know exactly what it is they sensed or saw, it only served to call their attention elsewhere while he escaped in the opposite direction. Now, the neat thing about the Jedi mind trick is that it's actually not that strong. Regardless of how powerful you are in the Force, it seems that there's an inherent limit on how much you can manipulate minds. Ben Kenobi seems to suggest that the ability itself only seems to work on those who are weak-minded, meaning that it's not your inherent power level in the Force, so to speak, that allows you to get better at using the ability. Rather, it's the weaknesses or limitations of another person's mind that give you the opportunity to exploit them. Now, with that in mind, even if someone was susceptible to a Jedi mind trick, there's no evidence to suggest that that person would be susceptible to having their emotions changed through the Force. And that's important because that's going to come up a little bit later in the video. There's no evidence to suggest that you can alter a person's emotions with the Force. And the Jedi mind trick itself is such a limited ability that it seems to be off the table when dealing with other Force users, meaning that you can't really use it on other relevant combatants. In fact, while I don't have any way to prove this absolutely, I have enough reason to believe that it wouldn't work on most main characters anyway, even those who aren't strong in the Force, because many of them have relatively strong or sharp minds as they're portrayed to us. Even the Dark Emperor himself, as powerful as he is, when he's trying to manipulate Luke, never bothers trying to penetrate his mind with the Force. And this is interesting because his entire plan to turn Luke over to the dark side was to exploit the weaknesses in his mentality in the first place. And despite the fact that the Dark Lord was confident that he could do that, he still had to rely on basic psychology and his awareness in the Force to do so. Even if Luke was able to be manipulated, it wasn't to such a degree that he could be susceptible to the Jedi mind trick. The last ability I want to talk about is telepathy. Only one character ever actually uses it, and when he does, he's talking to another Force-sensitive character. That may or may not be a requirement of the ability, I simply have no idea. Force Ghosts might also be using it, but in that case, I don't know if it really counts as a separate ability, because Force Ghosts are one with the Force, they're technically everywhere. Alright, that just about covers the bulk of the mental abilities you get through the Force. There are some other things that I want to talk about when it comes to those abilities, but I'll mention those a little bit later in the video when I talk about the particulars of the dark side. That's right, baby, I didn't forget. It has its own special section. But before we get to that, I want to talk about the telekinesis you get through the Force. Now, obviously, the Force surrounds all things, and through your ability to control the Force itself in its raw, purest essence, you gain the ability to move objects that are encapsulated by the Force, which, if you remember, is literally everything. I'm not gonna hold you, bruh, Upon seeing Luke use telekinesis for the first time, I really did start sweating. Because if you're as well versed with fantasy and fiction and sci-fi like I am, as a magic system expert, you grow to be infuriated by these types of abilities. There's nothing inherently wrong with the concept of telekinesis, but the problem is, writers who use it oftentimes are really flimsy with it. They're very touch and go, very fast and loose. And it results in characters being capable of very ridiculous things. Many of the writers also don't like to create consistent limits for telekinesis. Now, luckily we're not covering the telekinesis in all of Star Wars, or even just the current canon, because if we did, honestly, this video wouldn't have got out, man. I would have thrown my computer out the window or something. Whew. But anyway, this part of the video isn't going to have that many subsections. Telekinesis within the Force is largely one whole thing. It is one ability with no subsets. It's made very clear in the story that one of the main prerequisites for learning how to move things with the Force is the ability to sense the Force. Apparently, that's the main prerequisite, although controlling the flow of the Force itself is an inherently separate skill. One can be skilled enough to sense things in the Force and not manipulate things. However, throughout the course of the story, it's made very clear that the telekinetic abilities, whether harnessing the dark side of the Force or not, simply don't scale as high on average as the mental abilities in the Force, because those mental abilities are the main prerequisite. You're generally going to be way stronger in those mental abilities than you are going to be with the physical ones. Now, when it comes to a lot of the different works of fiction in Star Wars, whether it's the games or the books or something like that, the comic books, and even in the fan base in general, many people like to refer to different uses of telekinesis, and they've gotten so used to it to the point where they treat them like their own abilities. The idea of holding something down in the Force, like stopping it from moving, almost like hold person. The idea of force push, pushing something, force pull, pulling something towards you, or even quote-unquote force speed, using the Force to enhance a person's speed and make them move faster. People treat those as if they are their own abilities or sub-skills, when in reality they're all literally doing, at least from my understanding, the exact same thing, at least in the original trilogy. There is no force push, pull, tear, wound, there's not even a force choke. All of those things are just applying the basic rules of telekinesis. It also seems to be that Luke uses telekinesis with his body. Whenever he does that massive jump or flip that he does, he's not only using his raw athleticism that he gets from Force guidance, but he's also using telekinesis, it seems, I think, I could be wrong about this, to fling himself very far in the air. Now, if he's not doing this, then I'm kind of confused, because that would mean that he gets super strength in the Force. We don't really see that come into play in any other circumstance, aside from him hitting Vader really hard with his lightsaber or whatever. Then again, he blocked a couple of pretty big blaster bolts from those, what are they called, those speeders. It was speeders, that's what they're called. Then again, I find it difficult to determine how much physical impact blaster bolts have in the first place. I mean, it looks like they have some kind of physical concussive blast to them, in which case I imagine that the bigger ones from those Walker mechs are pretty powerful, but at other times, that physical impact doesn't seem to matter that much. There's also the fact that that armor that the stormtroopers use really doesn't do anything, but I don't want to talk about that because let's be honest, for everybody's sake, I'm just gonna leave it alone, because we'd be here all day. Now, interestingly enough, it is made very clear that the telekinesis you get through the Force is capable of not only moving objects around, but also damaging objects, tearing objects off the wall, and even physically moving and or wounding people, whether it be yourself or others. And it seems to be that that's why Luke is able to use it to produce those massive leaps. Now, obviously when it comes to moving things with the Force, your ability to do so is limited by a couple of things. The Force always seems to take some level of focus and concentration. You have to be somewhat locked in order to use it in the first place. Having said that, it doesn't seem to be as big of a deal when you get stronger in the Force. For example, Sideous was able to undo handcuffs from a distance with a simple flick of his finger. Now, having said that though, we haven't seen characters move very many things in the story. Certainly not many things that are heavy. The heaviest thing that we've ever seen anyone move was the X-Wing fighter, and that was Yoda, who's probably the oldest known Force user in the story, by his own admission being around 900 years old. And even then, it almost seems to be that he's using some meaningful level of effort. How much? I have no idea. However, one of the main reasons that we don't see as much telekinesis use as you would think is not simply because characters like Luke aren't strong enough to use it on a large scale. In reality, is because most uses that people think of when they talk about how overpowered telekinesis is, oftentimes directly revolve hurting somebody. Whether it's physically restraining somebody, squeezing somebody, throwing something at somebody, or even something like force choke, just squeezing someone's throat and hurting them. The problem is, these aren't just facets of telekinesis. In Star Wars, these are proponents of the dark side of the Force. So let's talk about that.
You gotta really dwell on it.
Anger, fear, aggression. These are the dark side of the Force. Hatred as well, and maybe even death, it seems. These are the darker aspects of the Force, and whenever harnessing the Force in anger or fear or in direct acts of aggression, or with the direct intention of hurting or harming someone, maybe even killing them, you are at least in part harnessing the dark side of the Force. This is why the Jedi are said to only use the Force for knowledge and defense, never to attack, because fundamentally speaking, it is simply impossible to do so without harnessing the dark side to some extent. Now, the truth as it is known to us in the original trilogy is that there are no abilities that are specifically an aspect of the dark side of the Force. Rather, any use of the Force that directly harnesses these aspects or emotions automatically becomes a dark side ability, and by leading into those aspects, you gain the strength of the dark side. That means abilities like Force Choke or Force Lightning, that are generally exclusively perceived to be abilities of the dark side of the Force, are only dark side abilities because the characters using them do so with the direct intention of hurting someone. They're acting in aggression or anger or hate. If there were cases in which they could be used without attempting to hurt someone intentionally, they would not be dark side abilities and they would not gain the enhancement of the dark side of the Force. But this alone is not enough to understand the dark side of the Force. This is simply the more technical aspects of it. The real question is, why is there a dark side of the Force anyway? And the answer to that is relatively simple. Going back to the more fundamental explanations of the Force, it is said that life creates the Force and makes it grow. It's very clear that the force of life itself and all of the things connected within it are what allows the Force to gain its nature. And obviously, it goes without saying that life also creates darkness. Life and awareness make fear, anger, aggression, evil, destruction, and life itself is both the harbinger and the herald of death. Life creates the darkness, and it makes it grow, and so too does the dark side of the Force itself grow. But the dark side is not evil. Anger, from a certain point of view, is not evil, nor is fear unto itself, and in a certain fashion, aggression isn't either. Hate? Yeah, you got me with hate, you got me, that's probably evil. But that's not really the point of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, even if certain parts of the dark side can be considered evil, and if a person can use the dark side maliciously, or with an evil mindset, this does not mean that the dark side itself is inherently evil as a whole. Now, this is a very important aspect of the story, at least in Empire Strikes Back. And unfortunately, if you don't understand that, then some of what we see in these movies probably wouldn't make any sense to you. Now, the Jedi see the Force as an inherently destructive or corruptive power. They see it as innately bad. Whenever the negative emotions that are associated with the dark side of the Force are at play, there the dark side will be also. Whenever you're annoyed, angry, upset, hateful, desiring revenge, or even just caught up in the heat of a battle, the dark side will be close at hand, quick to join you in any endeavor. It's not any stronger than the rest of the Force. However, it's made very clear that tapping into the dark side of the Force is actually very, very easy, and the Jedi fear that some people will use it as a shortcut for power. But this boost in power isn't free, because whether it's an undisciplined person using the dark side of the Force to gain quick power, or whether it's a skilled, disciplined Force user falling to the dark side, even if the dark side of the Force itself is not evil, tapping into it directly incentivizes harnessing negative or toxic qualities to gain a boost in power. Learning to rely on that power and giving into it without restraints could very easily push a person into doing inherently bad or evil things without a second thought. At least that's the idea. Now, I'm gonna be frank with you guys. As a person who's watched many of these movies over and over the course of 20 years, I've come to learn that in the mainline canon, from my observations, not a single character has ever been corrupted by the dark side of the Force. Not a single one in these movies. Not a single one. Not Luke, not Vader, not Anakin, not Sidious, nobody. There is not one character that was corrupted by the dark side of the Force itself. Rather, those characters who fall to it were corrupted by the darkness in their own hearts. The Force cannot be blamed for such things. This is a failing of the person and the internal machinations within. The problem is, a character being sensitive to the Force and having access to it makes a person falling to their own darkness much more risky, much more dangerous. I've watched people in real life give in to the darkness in their own hearts for advantages that didn't innately involve them inherently gaining a higher power level. Imagine how bad it would be if giving into your own darkness immediately made you stronger and faster, and directly enhanced your ability to hurt people with some kind of esoteric magic ability. Now, the interesting thing about the Jedi, as portrayed by Yoda in the original trilogy, is that they not only see the inherent risks and dangers of using the dark side of the Force, and they recognize that it requires a severe amount of restraint to not fall to. However, Yoda himself, and by extension possibly the entire Jedi Order, or at least most of it, is so concerned with the trappings of the dark side of the Force that they'd rather it not be used at all. After all, why take the risk, right? However, the story makes it very clear that the Jedi's interpretation of how the Force should be used is inherently flawed and relatively dogmatic, even if their concerns are valid. For starters, upon Yoda first meeting Luke Skywalker, he makes every excuse known to mankind to avoid having to train this man, insisting that his thirst for adventure or excitement is some inherent flaw that jeopardizes his ability to be a proper Jedi. He also insists that he's too old to be trained, because apparently the level of training and discipline it takes to be a Jedi requires you to start very young when your mind is much more malleable, which unto itself is not entirely unreasonable until you realize how dogmatic this man is about the Force itself. To be fair, he's still probably salty about the way Anakin fell to the dark side, but never mind that. The truth is, they train the Jedi from when they're young, not just so that they have more time to master their abilities as they grow up, but also, let's be frank, because those children are more subject to indoctrination. They want to get to those children young to make sure they can beat out any idea they think might threaten their order, or increase the risk of a person falling to the dark side, or being aggressive, or whatever. It's so bad that Yoda goes so far as to scoff at the idea that Luke would like the idea of excitement and adventure, despite he, by his own admission, watching him his entire life and seeing how destitute it was, living on a planet with no potential and no meaningful future. Of course the boy wanted something interesting to do. This also shows us that the Jedi, at least Yoda, who seems to be the oldest among them even before they all died, despite being skilled and knowledgeable in the Force, wasn't necessarily that good at negotiating with people's emotions. Either it's his way or it's the highway. He doesn't seem to have prepared any meaningful ways to help a person learning how to use their powers in the Force, aside from scolding them and telling them that they're doing it wrong. Probably because a lot of those ideas and emotions are beaten out of children by the time they grow up to Luke's age anyway. And given the information just in this one movie, The Empire Strikes Back, without making any major assumptions, I have zero reason to believe that the Jedi Order is very much different from what I'm describing. Because this is literally what we're seeing. Obviously all Jedi weren't like Yoda, but Yoda is literally 900 years old. This man is almost 1,000 years old. How can he not represent the rigid nature of the Jedi as they were? He's been around for a massive chunk of their history. If Yoda himself was somehow unorthodox, or didn't represent the very image of what the Jedi were, then that probably wouldn't be the best storytelling, especially since the story isn't inherently clear with that information anyway. When Luke asks him simple questions about the Force, about why the dark side of the Force is bad and why it shouldn't be used, he shuts him down immediately. He fusses that there is no reason. There is no reason that the Force is like this. There is no reason that you're supposed to do it this way. You do it this way because I told you, and that's how it is. And then he shuts down the training for that day. Yoda himself insists that the moment a person starts down the path of the dark side, that it will forever dominate them from that point forth, as if ever indulging the darkness in one's heart at all will automatically guarantee that a person eventually turns into a big bad evil guy. His beliefs do not account for redemption, and they certainly don't account for Luke casually using the dark side of the Force to strangle a couple of guards at the beginning of the third movie, or the fact that he started his path to the dark side at the ending of the second movie, despite never truly falling to it. Now, given my history on giving my opinions on things and sometimes critiquing and criticizing things, there are many people that are already firing up their keyboards right now to make comments defending the series. But over the past several minutes of exposition that I've given you, I've not made any actual criticism on the series. This is just exposition. I'm simply telling you how the magic system and the characters' interpretations of it are used in the story. My indictment of one character or criticism towards that character as a person or their mentality is not the same thing as me criticizing the story as a whole. It would really disappoint me if I posted this video and looked in the comments section only to discover that someone was upset with me that I criticized Yoda or the Jedi, because this is as good as it gets. Now ultimately this goes to show that the Jedi meant well, but they had some flawed ways of thinking that kind of got in the way of their success. Moreover, the Jedi way as it is known to us in the original trilogy inherently seems to sabotage and alienate certain personalities out of fear of the dark side boogeyman. After all, how would you act if you were restricted in your very ability to think by your cult out of fear of becoming evil? Honestly, I'm surprised the Jedi lasted as long as they did. But ultimately, the dark side of the Force is no more evil than the person wielding it. If a person has restraint, tact, and morality, it's not likely that they will fall to their own emotions, just as you can see in the real world. The risk is simply higher. Now, I say all of that because this is probably one of the best aspects of the original trilogy, as far as the magic system and the way that the story reacts to it is concerned. This is good governance, because even though the agents in the story are limited and flawed creatures, the conflicts surrounding how they interact with the Force and what it means about their person and their way of life are very valid, very reasonable conflicts of interest to have. Especially after the fact that the entire Jedi Order has fallen to one or two characters who have given into the dark side, like Vader and Sidious. Vader himself being instrumental in destroying the entire Order as it's known. If Yoda's mentality wasn't always this rigid, it certainly makes sense that it is this rigid now. And as flawed as his character is, honestly, it's hard to blame him sometimes. So there are a few more things I want to talk about when it comes to how the dark side of the Force is used within the story. However, before we talk about those things, I want to take some time to discuss Force Lightning, not only because I forgot to mention it earlier, but also I didn't exactly know where to put it in the video. I figured it might ruin my segue or something. Now, having said that, Force Lightning is an interesting ability, because it's one of those abilities that people often directly associate with the dark side of the Force. However, if you were listening earlier, I explained how that doesn't exactly work in the original trilogy. At least not with any evidence that the story has given us. At face value, Force Lightning is kind of a surprising ability, and I'm pretty sure that was intentional. Having said that, there is at least a little bit of underlying logic that explains how it works, and that would be the fact that the Force is, canonically, a giant energy field. It's not too unreasonable to say that a person who's strong enough in the Force can harness that energy and slap people with it raw, as opposed to using a mind trick or telekinesis. At least that's my best guess with the rules of the system itself. The writer may have had something else in mind, but he never really made it clear. So remember when I said earlier that the conflict involving Luke and Yoda was the second best part of the trilogy? Well, we're about to talk about the thing that takes the top spot. That's right, baby, it's time to talk about Luke, Vader, the cave, and prosthesis. Some of those things sound like they're not related, but hear me out. Now, if you've watched the original trilogy, you probably know there's a strong duality between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. And the reason for that is not just because they're related. We eventually find out that Darth Vader is actually Luke's father. That's besides the point. The reason there's a duality between these characters is because they represent two sides of the same coin. And this thought process is supported by not only the plot of the story itself, but also the vision that Luke received in the cave that I assume he eventually comes to understand in the story, as well as the existence of mechanical prosthesis and even the way that it's discussed and shown in the story. That it seems to be in the original trilogy, prosthesis represent either the dark side or the darkness within a person, which as far as this analysis is concerned, those are basically the same thing. And these cybernetic parts are used to further enhance the duality of Luke and Vader. See, when Luke first discovered that Vader was his father, he was emotionally scarred by that. Not only emotionally, but physically as well. Despite the fact that Vader cut off his hand in that encounter, he very quickly got a robotic arm to replace it. So to the untrained eye, this seems like a pointless thing, almost as if he got his hand cut off just for the sake of being dramatic. But there's more to it than that. It's a marker meant to represent the darkness within himself, that, if left unchecked, could very easily have the capacity to overcome him. However, despite that, it's simply a part of who he is that he has to accept, and he still has the capacity to be an agent for good. Now on the other hand, we have Vader, who, as we learn in the story, is actually kind of a cyborg. He seems to be made mostly of machinery. It seems that his limbs and some other parts of his body are either completely mechanical themselves or kept alive by machinery. Now that and the life support suit that he wears as a result might seem only like they're there for dramatic effect, or that they're there to give him that villainous look and that dark silhouette that everybody loves. While Vader was once a full person, he fell to the dark side, and that darkness is represented by that machinery, by the cold lack of humanity that machinery portrays. However, down at his core, he's still a person and he's still a human. You could also argue that he's still a Jedi as well. And therefore, not being completely stripped of his humanity, he still has some good in him, some light, some opportunity to be an agent of good. Skipping over to the third movie, the first time we see Luke outside of a hologram, he's actively using the dark side of the Force casually on goons. We also see that he's very clearly different because he's wearing black, and despite that, it's not as if he fell to the dark side. It was made very clear this is the wisest and most complete version of himself that we've ever seen. And despite that, he's still actively willing to use the dark side of the Force casually, despite the fact that he was warned to never so much as lean into it because the cost would be so severe. Even the dialogue that he has right after this with Jabba the Hutt, where he literally tells him that either you can benefit from me taking Han Solo back, or you can be destroyed. This man is talking mad heavy for a Jedi. And what this tells us is not that he fell to the dark side, but rather he's accepted that darkness as a part of his identity. Not that it dominates him, just that it's a part of him and he's accepted that. But in accepting that, he also came to terms with the fact that there's a part of Vader, much like himself, that can be redeemed. And here we have two opposing forces that are both secretly the same. We have Luke, who's a vessel for good, but carries within him darkness that, if left unchecked, could cause him to become Vader, who is the opposite, who is almost completely overtaken by darkness, but within him carries light that gives him the opportunity to flip the script if only he were willing. They're both inversions of each other, but they're two sides of the same whole. The ultimate tug-of-war within the world and within oneself to seek balance. Not for one side to eradicate the other, or for one side to deny the other, but for two forces in the universe and the self to exist as one accepted, integrated, healthy whole. Vader didn't fall to talk no jutsu or have a random change of heart. He fell, or rather converted, by way of Luke's attempts to appeal to the light that he always had inside of him. Now, all this information I'm telling you now is actually, at least in part, information that Luke was given by the Force in the second movie. When Luke went into the cave that was strong in the dark side on Dagobah, it was said that the cave would only contain whatever Luke brought with him. And it's there that Luke was given the first hint of these themes. Because while he saw a vision of Vader within it, he ultimately discovered that under the mask was actually his face instead. Which, at least thematically or philosophically, means that he is Vader. Of course, that statement would also imply that the opposite is true. After truly coming to understand the significance of this, and realizing that Vader was his father, He knew he had to do all that he could to save Vader. Now this, and by this I mean the way that the vision in the cave interacts with the entire story, is literally the single most significant use of the Force in the entire trilogy. This is the best part. This is the most important part. If you literally took out all of the Force, all the powers, all the telekinesis, if you took everything out, if you took the dark side of the Force out, if you took the prosthesis out, if you took everything out of this story, and you only left this vision, aside from the mysticism you get from the Force, you get the bulk of the utility. This is the most important use of the Force in the entire story. And I really wish that the story was full of uses like this. Things that tap people not only into their own subconscious, helping them to understand themselves, but helping them to understand the world, as both a warning sign and as an opportunity to grow as a person, to become better and to evolve, both for the benefit of yourself and those around you. People claim that Star Wars is so iconic, not just because of its cool sci-fi setting, also because of these primitive conceptual themes that it taps into, and this is a perfect example of that. Having a couple of nifty, psychic and telekinetic abilities really pales in comparison. That's not to say that those things can't exist in a story, but expressions like this are far more significant and do much more for the story. Now that was a mouthful, my apologies, but I said all of that not just because it's relatively important to the analysis that I'm giving you guys in this video, but also because it is my favorite part of these movies. The third reason, of course, is because I have to prove very quickly that I'm actually capable of understanding the nuances of the story as opposed to just the technical aspects of the magic system. Because every time I do a magic system review or anything remotely close to it, the moment I criticize the story, people will talk to me as if I was born yesterday. Like I don't understand the story and I only care about flashy powers or logical consistency or whatever. But let it be known from this point forward, from now to the end of the video, it is okay to disagree with my opinions without trying to insist that I somehow don't understand the story. People will swear on their grandmother's grave that I just don't get it and that the themes are super complex and that makes up for the flaws in the magic system. But the truth be told, I care more about execution than I do the general idea or themes. I uplift this part of the story so much because of not only the theme but the execution of those themes. And having said that, I don't have much more to say before I begin the official magic system review. So far, despite having the criteria that I use for years now, I've only officially scored Gurren Lagann and Ninjutsu from Naruto. Unfortunately, in my grading system on a scale of 1 to 10, the lowest grade you can score and be considered a passing one is 6 out of 10, and neither of those systems reach that mark. So the question is, will Star Wars be the first system to break the chain, or do I have to find another favorite movie series? Let's see. First, let's talk about the grading system that I use. It has 3 categories within it, each of which I'll scale on a measure of 1 to 10, and I'll average those numbers together to determine the official score. The 3 criteria that I judge magic systems are cohesion, governance, and limitation. I actually have several videos in which I discuss these, so I'm not going to spend too much time explaining them now. The first is cohesion. Cohesion represents the overall cohesiveness of the magic system and its rules. Do the rules make sense, given the context of the other rules, or do they contradict each other and step on each other's toes? It also takes into consideration how well the writers give viewers information, because no matter how much sense a system makes, if the writer's terrible at explaining it and giving that information to the viewers, then it really doesn't matter in the first place. It also takes into account whether or not the writer gives the viewers all of the important information or not, because whether you're in a hard magic system or a soft one, the truth is that not all details pertaining to the system necessarily matter. But the writer is always responsible for giving the viewers the details that do matter. If there's critical information that we should know for the plot to be understood, or to justify conflict resolution, or to understand the world building, and that information is not given to us or we have to guess, the score will go down. The next category is governance. If Cohesion grades how consistent the magic system is with itself and its own rules, Governance judges how consistent the world is with the rules of that magic system. Do characters in the universe react and behave as though this system were in place, that it actually affects them to whatever degree that it should? Does the way that people use technology, their philosophy, their religions, their belief, actually make sense given the presence of the magic system? Or does it feel like the magic system is agnostic from most of the world building? Governance is not just a scale of criteria, it's also an art, because even if the magic system affects the world, depending on what the system's rules are, there's no reason that it necessarily has to affect everything. The point is, does the way the world work as a result logically correlate to the system that we're given and that's explained to us? Now, I will say that magic systems that shouldn't affect the world at large naturally have an easier time with this criteria, but beyond that, there are no passes. And lastly, we have limitation. The limitation criteria does not simply judge whether or not limits exist in the story. It exists the presence of those limits and how they affect the story's conflict and conflict resolution in a narratively satisfactory manner. Not whether or not there are limits, or whether or not problems get solved, or whether or not you can technically argue that characters have limits, but how well do those limits positively affect the story's conflict and conflict resolution. And it's also worth noting that certain parts of the magic system, if they're flawed, can cause problems that may or may not affect one or more of these categories. Now, overall, as always, the idea of the magic system itself is perfectly fine. The story makes it clear where most of the powers of the Force come from. We know that the Force is around, encapsulates, and resides within everything, and that life creates it and makes it grow. This basic explanation is the justification for pretty much all of the powers within the Force. For example, Force lightning is justified by the fact that it's just concentrated energy made from an energy field, and that's only really surprising because it's usually used for telekinesis. Or for extrasensory perception, for example the stuff that's used in Force guidance, or the ability to sense the past and future, because everything's connected to it. However, I do have a couple of discrepancies that I want to talk about. For starters, and this is something I thought about for a really long time, and that would be, why is it that in the original trilogy, only some people have the Force? And this is really weird. The way it's explained, it almost seems to be that it's something that everyone should have a stake in. Not only just the people, all the different races of aliens, even the natural wildlife, seems like it should have a stake in the Force. If they're all connected to the Force and they directly contribute to it, so much so that their nature as sentient beings reflects the way the Force works, not only being able to tap into people's minds and sense things, but also that it directly creates the dark side of the Force, because people and sentient beings themselves have a dark side. Why is it that only some people have the Force? That's really weird to me. Now, in the third movie, Yoda tells Luke that his family line is strong in the Force, and that he should pass on what he's learned.
What?
He's supposed to have kids to keep the Jedi going. But why is it that only some family lines are strong in the Force? Now, some people might get very technical and pedantic and hop on the specific wording of strong in the Force to suggest that everyone has the Force, but it's just stronger in some families than others, or some people's bloodlines or some individual people than others. The problem is, that doesn't change anything. We effectively have the exact same question, which is why? What about one person gives them a stronger connection to the Force? And it's not as if they have Dragon Ball Z power levels where everybody has their own ki or chi or chakra or something like that. That doesn't seem to be the case, at least as portrayed in the movies themselves. Now, in later installments of the series, they introduced the concept of midichlorians to try to explain and justify this, but the reason the writer did that, even if we don't like that justification, he did it because he knew it didn't make sense. There is no reason to me that the Force should cherry pick unless it has a mind of its own, and that's a whole nother discussion. At least from the way it looks in the original trilogy, there is no evidence to support the idea that the Force has a mind of its own, that it somehow chooses wielders, and by extension conveniently chooses how strong they're going to be, or what information it gives them with Force guidance. That doesn't seem to be the way that it works at all. And if it did, it would directly take away from the story, because now we have to ask too many questions. Because if the Force has an innate mind of its own, then it effectively has, at least, the power of a god without having an explanation for why it only partially interferes and why it doesn't just solve all of the problems. Because if it has a mind and will of its own, then it obviously should be directly moving towards that will, as opposed to playing chicken with it by allowing certain things that it doesn't want to happen, by causing travesties like the Jedi being exterminated, only to 20 years later have one of those fallen Jedi come bring the Force back in balance. Unless the Force wanted a good story, but that's a whole separate discussion. If there is a reason that the Force is like this, it should be in the story. But it's not in the story, because that's not how it works. The Force does not have a mind of its own, it's just a force or a reaction of the living beings around it, which everyone should have a stake in, and there's no reason to me that everyone shouldn't be able to train to use the Force as a result. How is it that so many people can have the Force used against them because they're connected to it, or have their thoughts read, or have their mind manipulated, or be Force choked because they're a part of the Force, but they can't directly benefit from it? At that point, being connected to the Force is just a liability, because some Jedi or Sith can come manipulate you. That really sucks. I mean, the whole it sucking thing isn't like that's not an indictment on the series. I'm just saying that's funny. It's not coming out of the score, I'm just saying. Now next, I would also have to note, unfortunately, that a number of the uses of the Force are inconsistent, and as a result, sometimes it looks like people aren't really using their powers when they should be. Now this one might be something that a few people find surprising, but I'm just gonna come out swinging with this one. Easiest example, here we go. Anyone willing to use the dark side of the Force has the ability to physically abuse people. You have the pretty much unmitigated, unchecked ability to hit people with the Force physically. We know for a fact that Vader is skilled enough to use the Force even in lightsaber fights. We see him casually ripping stuff off the wall with the Force and throwing it at Luke, knocking him around, but we also see he's casually able to just Force choke people. Even Luke in the third movie at the very beginning, when tapping into the dark side of the Force as little as he does, can casually just Force choke people without a second thought and keep walking. He does it to 2 people, by the way, 2 people at once. Also, I'd like to remind you that aside from Leia, this is the weakest character in the Force in the entire trilogy. Now, in the case of Vader, despite the fact that we all know that he was trying to kill Obi-Wan, they both decided to wiggle their glow sticks at each other instead of Vader using the obvious opportunity to attack him with the Force. Whether it be Force choke, whether he pushes him with the Force, because you can produce physical force on people. He could push him, he could choke him, he could throw something at him, he could hold him down so he can poke him with the lightsaber. Obi-Wan literally doing that weird spin thing. No reason for any of this. Free hits, by the way. There's no reason that Vader couldn't have used it defensively in his final fight against Luke. Yes, Luke was overcome with rage and the dark side of the Force, and he started wailing on Vader, but mind you, Vader is probably still way stronger than him. The problem was he wasn't really doing anything, not just in the sense that he was conflicted that he didn't want to hurt Luke, but there's no reason he couldn't have tried harder to protect himself. Especially when he can get this boy up off of him by either throwing something at him or just grabbing him with the Force to hold him. Like with the rules of the way the Force works, you have free hold person. You can just say, hey bro, chill, and then that person can't move. You might say Isaiah, they never showed that. Right, but they showed all the basic prerequisites and logic to suggest that this is possible. And you can't say that these people are too weak to do that, because we've already seen Vader do equally significant things, just not on a person. You might also argue that Isaiah, it's because people have resistance to the Force. Clearly not normal people. You might say, well, people who are strong in the Force have a resistance to Force abilities, including telekinesis. The problem with that is there's no evidence. There's zero evidence in the story to suggest that. I'm pretty sure that either came from a comic book or one of the extended universe book series or something like that. That is not an actual feature of the original story. There is no implication of that either. Even so much as an offhanded line from a character like Yoda or Ben would have easily cemented that as perfectly viable logic, but it simply doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. And once he finally turns to be an agent of good, to try to protect Luke from Sidious when he's getting hit with Force lightning, notice how Vader ultimately dies because he was wounded by the lightning that Sidious was wielding. However, If he had just used the Force, he would still be alive to this day. I'm just saying. If he pushed him off the ledge, grabbed something and knocked him over with it, it would have been fine. He would have survived and he wouldn't have taken any physical injuries. Again, there's no reason to suggest that Sidious is somehow resistant. You could argue that he should have been able to predict that with the Force, but seeing as Sidious is literally clairvoyant and didn't detect the physical attempt to stop him, there's no reason that he would magically detect it just because Vader used the Force. Now, side note, when it comes to resistance to these abilities in the magic system, one thing that bothers me about having been doing the whole magic system thing for 16 plus years, and having technically been a content creator for 4, almost 5 years, every single time I talk about one of these hacks abilities that characters should be using more often, the first thing people say to me, without fail, regardless of what system we're talking about, is they insist that there's some kind of magical ambiguous spirit resistance. But the problem is, 99% of the time, with a 0.5% margin of error, it is never true. It is literally just not true and there's no evidence. People just say it just because. I'm gonna give it a pass in this case because, like I said, it might just be that it was in one of the extended canon works of fiction. But without fail, regardless of system, it always comes up, every single time. At this point, I'm beginning to think that there's no actual reason people think this, and they're just actively weaponizing headcanon to defend their series. So with all of this in mind, it's very apparent the Force-wielding characters who are willing to weaponize it against people, meaning all dark side users including Luke, conveniently don't use their insta-win powers in the situation where they completely solve their problem. And we know they're all strong enough to do so because we've seen them do similar things. In fact, while we're on the subject, one time we actually saw Vader force choking somebody remotely on a video call. This man choked somebody else through the Force over Skype. Are you kidding me? Ain't no way I'd ever let somebody force choke me on Facetime. That's devious work. Hey, you ever wanted to just grab somebody through the phone? Okay, all jokes aside, how did he do this exactly? So not only can Vader use the Force to choke people from close to mid-range, he can also do it to you over what should effectively be long distance, or at the very least when you're out of his immediate vicinity. That's crazy. I feel like that would have came in handy at some point. And it's not as if he has to be able to see you visually in order for it to work. That's not a prerequisite for Force abilities. And the reason that we know that for a fact is because some of the first few use cases we see of the Force are characters using it to sense things they can't normally see, and actively extending their range of senses beyond just their physical ones. I would also like to remind you all that it's confirmed in the plot already that Yoda was strong enough to spy on Luke his whole life, because apparently the Force just gives you scrying apparently. So we know being able to see someone isn't a real prerequisite when using Force abilities, because they also possess the ability that would allow them to sense and see someone from a distance. But if we're to believe his ability to do this is possible, then this produces a couple of issues, doesn't it? And what would those be, you might ask? So remember in A New Hope, when the Rebels' last stand against the Death Star was to make an impossible shot that would create a chain reaction and destroy the whole thing, but in order to do that, they had several starfighter ships flying around the Death Star, fighting and trying to survive against TIE fighters so that they have the opportunity to take that shot. One of those TIE fighters being piloted by Darth Vader himself. That's right, you guys already know where I'm going with this. Even if we assumed he could only produce exactly enough pressure to strangle somebody to death, there's no reason the Rebels would have won. The first movie would have been an instant loss. The moment he hopped in that TIE fighter and flew out, and don't say he wasn't using the Force, or that it's too difficult for him or something, because Force choke is too casual. He could have been strangling these people out from their immediate vicinity. And when I say these people, I'm not talking about random people like Biggs. You already know I'm talking about Luke. Luke was a hair's breadth away. Vader was on this man's tail, so much so that he basically almost killed R2. Even if Luke also has the Force and the Force was guiding him, I have no reason to believe that he couldn't have either strangled him out in the ship or used the Force to stop his hands from moving on the steering wheel. At that point, it's game, instant loss, what can I say? And yeah, that sounds cheap, right? But here's the thing. I didn't make the magic system. So is it my cheap solution to problems, or did the writer make a magic system that validates cheap solutions and conveniently ignored it? If cheap solutions exist in the story, it's because the writer allowed that opportunity. So even if what I'm saying sounds crappy, I'm not insisting that the story should have ended this way. I'm not insisting these things should have happened. But they're supposed to happen with the system that we have, and if the writer didn't want that, they should have wrote the system a different way. They should have wrote something else. Another minor example is Luke's incredible agility. I talked about this earlier in the video, where he's able to use what I assume is some combination of telekinesis and force guidance to create these incredible leaps, and he does that a few times throughout the story.
Can we get much higher?
Maybe once or twice in the second movie and 2 or 3 times in the third movie. Now, if you using the force on yourself empowers you this much, why are his physical feats outside of dexterity only limited to using the force jump? Which is strange. He doesn't even bother using it horizontally. If we're to believe that this is how it works, that he's using the force to empower these jumps, this implies a potential increase to not only either his physical strength to make that jump in the first place, or at the very least, some incredible speed and agility. But for some reason, he only uses it on the jumps. Now, I understand why other characters don't do this. For example, Vader kinda doesn't need to, and he's also old, injured, dying cyborg, so if he doesn't do it, I can accept that. Sidious, it's against his theme. He doesn't even actually use a weapon, so why would he get up and physically fight, right? Makes perfect sense. But for Luke specifically, it's kinda weird. Now, I understand the reason already. This is most likely due to technical limitations. I still feel as though they could have done something with the technology they had in that day and age. Either that, or they could have just not given him the Jedi leap. Now, to be fair, like I said, that agility is also portrayed by his ability to use a lightsaber and deflect blaster bolts and things like that. But if we're assuming, like a lot of people do, and to be fair, in this case it's a very fair assumption, if we're assuming that the blaster bolts are at least as fast as bullets in real life, then you're only adding to my argument unintentionally. What we're saying is, he has an incredible agility only in a couple of specific cases. If he's deflecting attacks, or if he's jumping, doesn't get it anywhere else. That's just kind of weird. Now, this is also the point in the video where I have to make something clear. Just because I have a criticism that I explain and I explain the context of it, does not mean I believe every single criticism is the end of the world. It's not as if I think his not having super speed completely destroys the whole story or something like that, obviously. But nonetheless, if I'm going to judge the system as a whole, I do have the right to consider these things. Even if they don't have the largest impact on the score, sometimes death by 1,000 cuts or 1,000 minor issues is something that happens. I do have to go on record and be clear about these types of things. Even if it doesn't matter as much as another criticism, that doesn't automatically make it a nitpick. Having something be the end of the freaking world is not the main prerequisite for being able to discuss it. That's not a fair thing to assert. Having said that, the comment section sometimes tends to disagree. Now, having said that though, there is a bit of a counter argument that you could make against this criticism. And that would be that you can argue it's implied that Luke is using the enhanced physicality he gets in the Force during lightsaber fights. And to be fair, that is not only technically, but functionally true. Having said that, that actually brings me to another issue that I have with the magic system. And that would be that there is also extreme ambiguity in when the Force is being used in the first place. Now, there are plenty of examples where characters are clearly obviously using the Force, and there are some situations where you assume or they're implied to be using the Force. But there are many circumstances or use cases for the Force abilities that are so unpronounced that it's technically kinda hard to tell when it's being used at all, or how well the character would have done without it other than having plot armor. If I am afforded the opportunity to attack the low-hanging fruit for just a moment, going back to the fight with Obi-Wan and Vader, these two guys didn't look like they were using the Force. For a minute I thought it was gonna be fine, and then Ben does that little twirl and I'm like, oh nah, what am I watching? In the case of Luke losing a fight to Vader, it wasn't immediately apparent that one of them was so much stronger than the other because of their skill or power in the Force, or even the dark side. That is, unless we're talking about the specific instance where Vader was throwing things around. Outside of that, both before and after that, it almost seems like Luke is just getting outskilled by somebody. And in the case of Luke beating Vader, it doesn't look like one of them is even all that much more powerful in the Force anyway. It really just looks like Luke is trying really hard to get this guy. That's really all it looks like. And besides, there's no Force power that conveniently stops Vader from fighting back. And while I understand the context of the themes that are supposed to be at play here, and I know that because I talked about it earlier, if we're judging this from a power system perspective, this is not a good thing. Now, there are some more cases in which characters don't seem to actually be using their powers, much if at all, that are at play here, but I'm going to put that aside for just a moment. You could make the argument that, just like I mentioned earlier, many of the uses of the Force are either very casual or passive, to the point where you don't necessarily have to activate them in the first place, that they're always at least in part in use. And that is fair, because I did say that myself. And so you could argue that even if it looks like characters aren't always really using the Force that much, this is just what the story looks like, and I'm supposed to just believe that the characters are using their powers anyway. Given the fact that these movies are pretty old, I'm sort of compelled to respect that argument more than I typically would, because I'm sure they had some technical limitations that got in the way. In a perfect world, the story would have just used a magic system that works within the confines of those limitations well. Unfortunately, I'm not super well versed in the means that they used to produce this movie, so I don't know if the technical limitations could have been overcome, or they could have portrayed it better, or if there really was no other way. I'm the magic system guy. I can't talk about all of that. All I can talk about is how the application of the magic system that we got adds to the story. I can't get into hypotheticals and technicals that may or may not be the case. I can't. However, in the case of arguing that we're supposed to simply believe that the Force is always at play, even if at least a little bit passively, then that itself causes a whole new issue. If a character is always at least in part guided by the Force, then that means both their successes and failures can sometimes be indistinguishable from plot convenience. Whenever something works out for a character who has and uses the Force and Force guidance, it's generally believed that the Force helped them there, that the Force was a boon to them in doing whatever that thing was. But we also see some of these same Force-wielding characters make mistakes and fail, and sometimes characters get the better of them in ways that you would have thought they were able to predict or counteract. If the Force is so powerful, their perception, their clairvoyance, their ability to sense their immediate surroundings outside of their typical senses, their ability to sense the past, people's emotions, people's thoughts, people's intentions, if you have all of these nifty features in the Force that make you a walking, talking apparatus of competence, and you're gaining some of those effects passively, then as a result, if you're taking the magic system seriously, then any situation where somebody gets the jump on that person is surprised by something doesn't go their way, or they lose a fight or even get a small injury in a fight, whether that person gets put into a trap, or their right-hand man screws them over in a way they weren't expecting, all situations like that for a person who is sufficiently strong in the Force almost seem unrealistic, because just with the rules we have in these three movies, with the sole exception of Luke in the first movie and the beginning of the second movie, it's too unrealistic to believe these things would happen to them without them being able to detect them, or at least having the raw skill and competence to counteract the problem. While Luke isn't seriously injured in the third movie, in the first real confrontation he gets into, he was almost made a fool out of by Jabba the Hutt because he was standing directly on a trap door that dropped him into the Rancor pit. And yeah, while he did eventually beat the Rancor and get out of it, the fact that none of his clairvoyance was active, right? And even if we arbitrarily assume that people using the Force don't have, like, conventional precognition, he's had the ability to predict the future since the second movie. And since then, by the beginning of the third movie, we're meant to believe that he is, in terms of his skills, effectively a complete Jedi. Meaning that his control over the Force is going to be much better than it was back then, that he's ready to confront Vader and Sidious, even though he wasn't the last time we saw him. And the other characters who are complete in their understanding and skill of the Force, even though canonically they all portray completely different levels of skill in the Force, are able to either scry and detect information from a distance or effectively spy on people in the case of Yoda, consistently for years, or have a profound ability to detect the future or people's intentions such that things like this could easily be avoided. And even if we're assuming that he couldn't have predicted this would happen ahead of time, or use his force senses to detect there was another life form under him or something like that, or detect that he was going to get it put into a trap in the future, or anything like that, he's still standing right in front of Jabba the Hutt, and he should have enough power in terms of his force senses that he can sense people's intentions or the environment around him just as he could in the first movie, just better. In the second movie, he was able to sense the darkness emanating from that cave that he went into before he even saw it. He detected it from a distance, but he somehow can't detect Jabba's intentions to trap him or even sense the Rancor directly below his feet. I don't know, man, sounds like plot to me. And while we're on the subject of sensing things and predicting things, since Luke has been able to, at least in part, sense and predict the future since episode 2, at any point during the third movie, he could have foresaw or sensed something in the Force that made him privy to the plan that Sidious had. Obviously, he already knew since the second movie, technically, the general idea of what Sidious's plan for him was, but Luke, so much as having 2 hours of foresight before he met him, probably would have blown the lid off the entire plan. And that goes for almost every Force-using character. They're able to sense things in the Force and predict the future, but somehow conveniently, information that's important to them that would affect them in the plot, they conveniently don't know. We have characters like Sidious, who, again, is able to predict and sense things so much that it effectively seems to be the defining trait that allows him to rule the galaxy. And despite that, he's able to detect people's emotions and their thoughts and the future. And we know his ability to do so is consistent and reliable because that's the point of the entire story. Otherwise, the story wouldn't have happened. But this one thing that's his undoing, conveniently he can't detect that. He can't somehow see the future a day ahead of time and detect that Luke is gonna cause Vader to change sides or something like that, or even that Vader's gonna betray him or something like that. You see, there are so many things that characters could sense that will completely alter the plot, but they conveniently just don't. Even though, need I remind you, the Force doesn't have a mind of its own, it's not deciding what people can and can't see. All of these characters are powerful enough to effectively weaponize or precisely use, even if we don't know exactly how precise their senses are, in terms of how much they can hone in on a specific event or emotion or anything like that. We know they're precise enough that they can use them for their own ends deliberately. But for some reason, only Sidious does so, and conveniently not when it kills him. And while we're on that subject, if characters can scry on each other, and there's no real verifiable proof or even an implication of some kind of force resistance or force cloaking ability, how is it that Sidious and Vader conveniently don't know about Yoda? Not only is there no indication that they know of his existence, but there's also the fact that in the second movie, when Luke first goes to confront Vader, he mentions that Obi-Wan has taught him well, believing that Obi-Wan has actually taught him anything. He also doesn't mention anyone else, including Yoda. And if Sidious was aware of Yoda, which there's no proof of, there's no reason he wouldn't have tried to hunt him down to complete the extinction. Because Yoda is a 900-year-old Jedi. He's probably the most powerful Jedi. He is literally the biggest risk since global warming. And if we're being frank, as far as Sidious is concerned, he should be the Antichrist. They gotta stop that man at all costs. But he's left unchecked because despite his power, his relative strength in the Force, and the ability that people can seek things out through the Force specifically, after all these years, neither Sidious nor Vader is capable of detecting that this man might even so much as still exist. Now, you might say all of this doesn't affect the plot, but that's entirely non sequitur. Whoops. If something should affect the plot to a significant margin and is conveniently absent from it, that is equally worthy of criticism. Now, as you may have noticed, even though the Force gains you a number of physical abilities, most of what I just criticized actually comes from the mental side of the Force abilities, the clairvoyance or the extrasensory perception that you get. And to be fair, those senses, if you're actually paying attention to the story, kind of ebb and flow almost entirely with the convenience of the plot. With all that being said, it causes the perceived power level of the characters to fluctuate by a pretty significant degree at times. And if you're tired of me giving examples of characters either not using their abilities as much as they're supposed to, or those abilities not being as prevalent as they should be, I do have an example of the reverse for you. And that would be that in A New Hope, the way the plot frames it, Obi-Wan kinda just decides to die, which is really weird. Now, as you know, he obviously does have the Force. How many times have I said Force today? Oh my god. And something really interesting happens in the story. Remember how I said earlier that there are situations like where Luke didn't detect the trap or didn't sense the Rancor under him or something like that? Well, in this specific case, we don't have that problem. Vader seems to have sensed the presence of Obi-Wan, and as a result, he goes looking for him throughout the Death Star. Interestingly enough, when the main characters are in the control room of the hangar, while they're making a plan on how they're going to escape, Obi-Wan not only decides to assist in that plan, but he looks up and says, you know what, actually? Nah, I'm just gonna die. Just kidding, he doesn't really say it like that. Obi-Wan looks up and he says something very weird. He doesn't just say that he wants to go alone and that Luke can't help him. He also immediately suggests that their paths lie on a different track, which would logically imply that Ben is aware that he's probably not going to see Luke again anytime soon, at least not in person. There's no reason for him to say this unless he realized that something's going to happen to him, either that he can't escape it or that he's going to give himself up and sacrifice himself. The problem is, that's stupid. There's no reason that Obi-Wan should believe that he's going to die in this scenario. The way it's framed, he's effectively given up on trying to get out of this alive. He doesn't seem defeated, he just seems to have accepted it, which is strange, because the future is always in motion. If he predicted this to be the case, or he deduced it, surely that fate can be changed. He never suggested or insisted that their paths would cross again. When he spoke, he was kinda final about it. So it's not as if he was going off on a side quest on his own and he'd be back eventually, even if they met up again outside of the Death Star. There doesn't seem to be any implication like that. The way the story makes it sound, especially upon rewatching, he makes it seem like he knows it's up. But why is that? Why is it that he's just okay with this, that he's gonna say that like it's an absolute for sure thing, when he has the same senses that Vader does? Perhaps he didn't sense his own future. Perhaps he sensed Vader and deduced what was going to happen. Well, alright, so what? And the way the situation is framed when they finally meet is even worse. In the same way that Vader could sense his presence and determine where he was going to be, there's nothing stopping Obi-Wan from sensing Vader standing there and then looping around the other side. Yes, I know the Death Star is probably a very complicated ship, but as we clearly saw, there are multiple paths that lead into the hangar. Multiple paths that lead into the same place. He could have just went around in a circle. And you can't tell me that wouldn't have worked, because Vader's the type of person to stand there while a door closes in front of him. We see this in the story as well. Between his ability to sense Vader, which he should be able to do, his ability to extend his senses to the world around him, and his clairvoyance, there's no reason that he shouldn't either A, be able to get out of the situation, or B, that this shouldn't devolve into a complicated game of cat and mouse. Of course, neither of those things happens, because the writer wanted him to die. They wanted him to give up and become a Force ghost, when in reality there was no real reason for it. And as mean as this sounds, let's be honest. If the story was better at giving exposition, then there really wouldn't need to be a Force ghost anyway, because all the information that's given could have been given by Yoda or somebody else. In fact, while this is my personal belief, I don't even think it makes the most sense in the trilogy for Ben to have died in that movie in the first place. It makes more sense that he gets out alive, maybe with the help of Luke, and then sacrifices himself so that Luke can get away in the beginning of the second movie. Because let's be frank, there is no logical reason why Luke and Vader didn't meet up at the beginning of the second movie, despite the fact that this man can for some reason sense Luke from whole solar systems away. The fact that he goes to the direction opposite of where Luke resides is ridiculous. Let me ask you an interesting question. I'm not sure if you noticed this, but if Luke was fighting off the giant Walker mechs with air speeders, and then he was gonna go escape with his X-Wing fighter, why were the X-Wings conveniently sitting outside where it snows? Someone had to move them out there. But as we saw, there are hangars inside the base that you can open up and fly out of. So why are the ships sitting outside? What was the point of moving them? I'll tell you why. Because the writer decided that Vader was gonna be inside and they didn't want them to be in the same place. Logically, they both would have been inside and they both would have got to scrapping. Unfortunately, that means that Luke would lose, and the writer didn't want that. Easiest way of solving this, in my opinion, again, is to let Ben survive, even if only barely in the first movie, and then use him to buy time at the beginning of the second. And then that loss will not only be fresh on the mind of Luke, but also on the viewers. And The Empire Strikes Back, the theme is the Empire striking back. The main characters take a loss, they lose. That would have compacted that theme significantly by starting the movie off with a major loss. And then before Obi-Wan dies in the second movie, he can simply tell Luke to go to Dagobah to complete his training there, and then he can die. And then in the third movie, we take all of his dialogue as a Force ghost, give part of it to Obi-Wan while he's still alive in the second movie, and give the rest of it to Yoda because he was already there anyway. Now, to be fair, I sort of put the baby in the tub before I put the bathwater in there in this case. But my next criticism revolved around Force Ghosts, and that would be the fact that even if they serve a purpose in the story, the purpose that they serve is suboptimal. And by they, I mean the one, which is Obi-Wan. The story starts a bunch of questions that really shouldn't have to be asked and never get answered because they poke holes in the story simply by adding Force Ghosts. In reality, it makes more sense to remove the Force Ghost concept entirely and just let Ben die like I mentioned earlier. Why is it that the writer needs a character to come back from the dead to give exposition? The fact that a person can be one with the Force or a part of the Force, as Ben suggests in the first movie that he became more powerful than he could imagine by dying, but the story and the writer conveniently limits the amount of information that he's willing to convey with him. And if he's really as powerful as he says he is and is truly one with the Force, he's not limited to sticking around on Dagobah. He could very well go somewhere else and spy on the enemy and then go tell Luke and Yoda everything they need to know. But it doesn't happen, does it? Because it's not that type of story. And if it's not that type of story, why does it have that type of ability? That's really weird. I mean, let's be frank, there's no real reason to play with the afterlife in this story anyway. That's not something the story needs in order to function. Now, I know some people are gonna say, Isaiah, Obi-Wan said he couldn't interfere as a Force ghost. But mind you, he already has interfered, just not physically. I'm not suggesting he has to kick up a Force storm or a Force push or something. I'm not asking him to choke Sidious in his sleep. I'm just asking him to give more meaningful, useful information because he's already interfered, telepathically speaking to Luke and Yoda. And it even went so far as to give them insider knowledge. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is Force guidance, because I recognized earlier in the video that I made a statement that some people probably might want an explanation for, that I mentioned Force guidance as a whole was kind of cheap and quite convenient, and I am fully willing to back that statement up. Now, obviously, as a magic system expert, I don't actually have an issue with the magic system being able to solve problems. However, I believe that there are a lot of occasions that would be more interesting if Force guidance didn't automatically solve them. For example, in the first movie, the ultimate resolution of the story is for Luke to use the same Force ability that he discovered 30 minutes into the story in order to one-shot a space station the size of the moon. This is obviously extremely plot convenient, not just because the Force allowed him to make that shot, but because there's no reason for it to be this way in the first place. The solution was contrived in such a way that Luke could simply use a basic feature of the Force to solve it. And instead, this conflict should have required a much more nuanced solution, especially when they were already on the Death Star in the first place. And if there was a weakness to exploit, the story could have very well been remodeled in such a way that they could have exploited that from the inside and attempted to escape. Which, if you've read or watched stories before, is usually how the fortress goes down anyway. I don't know why the writer didn't think of this specifically. There is no need for them to leave and come back, but that's a side note. Now, I understand that time and budget is limited, but I still believe it's a writer's responsibility to make this make sense, as opposed to just relying on a bunch of contrivances. I also feel that way when it comes to the lightsaber fights. Now, one of the arguments that many people would level against me around this point of the video is to say that either I don't understand the story, like I don't get it, or they'll appeal to the general idea or themes of the story as a justification or as a pass so they don't have to worry about other more nuanced details, despite the fact that those more nuanced details would add to the enjoyment of the story. For example, with the lightsaber fights. People love the lightsaber fights. Even if the choreography of the lightsaber fights isn't always the best, people do enjoy these fights. They enjoy the action scenes that the characters get into. But I find it strange that despite the fact that Luke has never received an ounce of sword training in his entire life, he still manages to go toe-to-toe with Vader on multiple occasions. Yes, it is implied that Vader is going easy on him, but Vader makes multiple remarks about how good he's doing, and the story acts upon the assumption that he's at least somewhat good at it even though his skills are not complete by the time of the second movie. By the point of the third movie, he's largely considered to be a full-on Jedi, again with no discernible sword training. Even so much as giving him a minor justification for why he can do these things, as opposed to saying because the Force said so, would have made the story and his journey a lot more interesting. You see what I'm saying? And don't tell me that there's no space for this, because there's actually plenty, and I can tell you exactly where they should have put it. As a writer, one of the things that I do the most is fixing things that I've done before to try my best to make them make most sense and to flow logically. This is a skill that you pick up over time. It's not that I think I'm better than George Lucas or something like that. The perfect way to have done this would have been to add some kind of sword training module or sword training droid or something like that. And you could add something like that from the start of the second movie inside the Rebel base. That way we can prove or justify, even if we only show it briefly, that the main character is at least attempting to practice training with the lightsaber. Because we know Yoda didn't teach him. By just adding one scene with some kind of training mech in the second movie near the beginning while they're still at the Rebel base, before they escape, would have easily solved this problem. Instead of being like, okay, the Force magically downloads swordsmanship skill abilities, we could have clearly seen that he was training, and even if it was only a brief scene, we would have known that he was doing so in the background and during the time skips. And that would have solved the problem. In fact, we wouldn't even need to double down on this by adding a scene in the third movie, because we know that as long as he has access to wherever the rebels are, he would have access to their training devices and would therefore be implied to be training in the background. And you might say already that, well, Isaiah, he's clearly been training on his own anyway. Yeah, he's been training in the Force. We haven't seen him sword fight anybody. Now, the reason this is so important is not just so that it makes sense in and of itself. What's important is that establishing logic allows you a proper foundation to build upon to add to things that are important. One of the most important aspects of Empire Strikes Back is that Luke had to make the choice of whether or not he was going to stay and complete his training and all that entails, or to go save his friends. And that unto itself has a number of facets within it. For example, there was the ideological differences between Luke and Yoda. There's also the interesting dynamic between him and his father. Beyond that though, there were many ways in which Luke was not prepared to fight the Sith. And it just so happens that one of those is sword skill. This man quite literally lost his hand in a sword duel. Yes, Vader was using the Force, he has Force guidance just like all Force users do. Yes, he was throwing things around, knocking Luke over with it, but the ultimate medium for his defeat was his lack of sword skills. He was outmaneuvered with the sword because Vader was simply better and he lost his hand, and that's how everything happened. At least on the physical side. There's also the shock when it comes to the fact that he realized that Vader was his father, but that in combination with the fact that he lost his hand in a sword duel, you know, an injury that he has to carry his whole life as a reminder of his failure and how he wasn't fully prepared, that means a whole lot more if there's an actual logical tangible reason, like his unpolished skills, as opposed to something ambiguous like he doesn't have enough Force points or something like that. Because let's be honest, if we have to blame this on his lack of Force power, then we have to grapple with the fact that the Force guidance is not very tangible or obvious, and if not for the fact that we are explicitly told that that's what's happening, we wouldn't really know it was the case. These two clearly fight like normal dudes. Without exposition telling us that their actions are guided by the Force, we have no reason to believe that there's any kind of super psychically enhanced action going on at all. You can say that's because of the budget, but that's entirely non sequitur. In fact, you'd be adding to my point, all the reason to do it the way that I'm suggesting. Because if it doesn't have any visible impact anyway, and we're just going to assume that it's working, we might as well have the event be justified by a tangible feature anyway. Swordsmanship is simply a much more tangible aspect than the ambiguous nature of Force guidance. So if it comes to a character solving a problem or failing to solve a problem, it makes more sense that it's as a result of this physical tangible feature. Now I'm going to be relatively brief with this next one because while it's something I think can negatively affect a story in the long run in general, I don't think it necessarily hurts this one that much because of this story's specific exact context. Now, having Jedi attempt to resist the dark side of the Force is not unreasonable in any capacity. I mentioned that earlier in the video. However, I would like to note that since the dark side of the Force is not all-consuming, like the Jedi propose that it is, this effectively means that as long as a person either has proper self-control, isn't deliberately falling to the dark side, or comes to their senses after a fight, then tapping into the dark side of the Force is basically a free power-up. You get it for free. Now, this obviously only applies to Jedi and characters who are incentivized to avoid falling to the dark side. For Sith, like characters like Sidious and Vader, it doesn't count because they're using it automatically anyway. And while I don't have any issues with the idea of a story where characters struggle with resisting a certain power or temptation, the truth is, this isn't like, for example, Naruto getting consumed by a tailed beast after he completely unleashes it, right? After you do that, the person is basically going to be gone. But the reality of the matter is, unless it's somebody who deliberately chooses to be a villain, who chooses to be evil or dive headlong into the dark side, a person dipping into it, even if they're more belligerent, is essentially free, because they're only going to be doing so in heated situations anyway. And while this is thematically very interesting, in terms of tangible story conflicts, it kind of takes away from it. Not as much as a willpower-based magic system, because they have similar components, they have similar aspects, but at least in the case of these movies, its opportunity to get in the way of the story is quite limited. After all, we know by the time of the second movie that tapping into the dark side of the Force isn't necessarily the end of the world anyway. And it's for that specific reason that if you look at the rules of the dark side of the Force and where it comes from, common sense dictates, just as I suppose in the dark side section of this video, that you can use the dark side of the Force and be fine as long as you don't dive headlong into it. So specifically because you can determine that from looking at the system itself and its rules and its lore, I don't consider the fact that a character like Luke being able to dip into it and gain access to that power without too much limit, or without being permanently corrupted or having a long-lasting effect, to really be much of a problem. It's close to becoming a problem, but it's not in this specific case. In a more prolonged story where there are more opportunities for this to matter, and where the heated scenes and battles matter much more and there's more of them, and opportunities to dip into the dark side of the Force, it could have mattered a lot more then. But in this case, the writer narrowly gets away with it. So while I'm bringing this up for context for those who are concerned, this isn't going to affect the score of the series negatively. Alright folks, we are almost there. I only have one more criticism to levy against the original trilogy, and that would be one of the core conflicts of the series doesn't work because it doesn't make sense. And you already know which one I'm talking about too. The fact that the Dark Lord himself took it upon himself to try to seduce Luke to the dark side of the Force unto itself is not an issue. However, the means for which he decided to do so makes zero sense because there's not a feature of the magic system that allows the thing he's trying to do to work in the first place. And this is one of those situations where people will stop me right here and say, Isaiah, it's about the themes. But as I've said multiple times in this video, themes don't justify a lack of execution. You still have to make it make sense. Of course, Sidious represents evil. He represents pure evil. I know that. But he's still a person in the story, and he still has to make sense in the same way that any other character would. At some point, he seduced Vader to the dark side of the Force and used him as a tool to destroy the Jedi. But this is not the case with Luke. For some reason, the Dark Lord believes that if he can convince Luke to fall to the dark side himself, then all of a sudden that guarantees that Luke will be his pawn, which is stupid. If he ever managed to get off his Force laurels and use his Force senses, he determined that Vader, in the second movie, was planning to try to overthrow him with the help of Luke. Vader is also under the influence of the dark side of the Force. Unless you believe he's lying, which is possible, but still, the question remains, why is it that Sidious believes that a person being in the dark side of the Force automatically grants him some kind of special control over them. Again, if we're looking at him as the concept of evil itself and someone falls to evil, then obviously evil controls them. But as a character, just because a person falls to the dark side, taps into it, or even becomes dedicated to it, that doesn't mean that they're going to be willing to listen to what Sidious has to say. What makes you think they're not so ambitious to not screw Sidious over? In fact, Sidious literally didn't even have a persuasive argument, despite the fact that he's supposed to be like the biggest chicken genius in the story, where he orchestrated all of these events, and the entire empire exists because he's so cool and awesome and he did his job so well. He somehow can't recognize that forcing someone to do something heinous doesn't mean they'll automatically do what he says. That doesn't make any sense. This is common sense. If I'm a criminal and I convince you to do a crime, that does not automatically mean you'll be my henchman forever. There's no rule in the rulebook of evil that says that. I mean, it's not as if I looked, but that's besides the point, isn't it? Especially since he wasn't doing it for Sidious, he was doing it for his own bidding. After Luke spazzes out and defeats Vader, Sidious gets up and goes, "Yeah, that's right, bro, you got him. Now come join my team." Like it's Mass Effect, like he's assembling the team or something. I'm like, bro, what? No, calm down. He treated it like a sure thing, which is crazy, because there's no ability in the Force that gives him the power to do that. He can't control people. He doesn't even bother using the Jedi mind trick on them because it doesn't work. But for some reason, he thinks he'll just fly into his control. Is that right? Is that how it works out here? Because quite frankly, I'm not seeing it. Now, this poses a question. Why is Sidious's stupidity in this case an indictment on the magic system and not simply on the character? Now, having said that, a person might argue that the magic system doesn't necessarily have to interact with every conflict in the story. I agree with that. I don't contest that at all. But the problem isn't that the magic system doesn't interact with it unto itself. The problem is that the story, the writer, and the character in question, the villain, all seem to unanimously be behaving under the belief that the magic system does interact with this core conflict. All three of them seem to believe that Luke falling to the dark side directly equates with him being the right-hand man of Sidious. These two, while not mutually exclusive, A, aren't the same thing, and B, the story gives us no reason that it would end up this way, despite insisting that it somehow would, as if it was a given or a guarantee. For a person who's as good at planning as Sidious, this makes him look kinda stupid. Especially when, yes, I'm beating a dead horse now, I'm sorry. Especially considering the fact that he could have used his Force senses to figure that out ahead of time. How does he only miss that part, the very end, when he can foresee, predict, and plan for all other relevant information? Except this last part, though. And Vader betraying him. Well, alright. Whatever. Looking back on it, this is actually a lot more criticisms than I thought I'd have. When I first set out about doing this video, I figured that the magic system wasn't even going to be that bad, but wow, there are so many criticisms. And as a person who's gone on record in the past saying that he actually likes Star Wars a lot, I'm starting to rethink that. I think I like the idea of the Force more than I like the Force itself. Alright everybody, it's time for the magic system score. Whatever happens, I want you guys to know that I thought about this for almost 3 months. This is by no means an arbitrary score. For cohesion, how cohesive are the rules? The highest I can possibly give it is a solid 8 out of 10. Nice. And the main reason for that would be the fact that I had some discrepancies when it comes to exactly who gets to use the Force. I believe that if the story had been logically consistent with the way the Force works, being something that all living beings have a stake in, there would actually be a lot more Force-sensitive characters. I believe that would have changed the plot and the world building by a significant portion. However, there's nothing stopping the core story from being the same regardless. And while this is a problem, I don't think the problem is large enough that it completely ruins the story or warrants a lower score than that. Now beyond that, I have some minor discrepancies that affect the cohesion score, and I think I can make a pretty fair case for dropping the score down to maybe 7.5 if we're lucky, but I'm gonna give it the benefit of the doubt and keep it at 8. For the governance score, It's not looking good, folks. I'll be honest with you, most of the criticisms that I levied in the past hour directly affect the governance score. That the rules in place for how the powers work, regardless of whether or not those rules are logical or consistent, the writers play fast and loose with whether or not the exact rules we're given are able to actually affect the plot in the way that they should. And there are plenty of examples of that in the video, some of which I cut for time because it got too tedious. Especially when I realized when I was making my notes, there are just so many different examples of this that I couldn't possibly fit them all into one video without my head exploding in frustration. There are too many occasions where characters who we know have established levels of power that they can at least draw upon, at minimum, and then refuse to do so. Almost every single thing that happens in the plot literally doesn't make sense when you consider the actual abilities that the characters in question have. Not abilities that they might have, abilities that we know for a fact that they have, because we've seen them use them. And every additional minute of my life that I think about this story, I think of more and more issues. The highest I could possibly argue for is a 4 out of 10 here. I can argue for lower, but as I said earlier, I want to go for the benefit of the doubt. And last but certainly not least, we have limitation. Does the combination of strengths and weaknesses that the power system has and the characters have access to meaningfully add to the shape of conflict and conflict resolution? Unfortunately, many of the criticisms that I levied earlier that affect the governance score also affect the limitation score. If characters have drastically inconsistent limitations, whatever restrictions they do have can't really positively affect the plot. If characters have overpowered or extremely useful abilities and the writer brushes it under the rug, then that just means the conflict resolution or lack thereof doesn't make any sense. And yeah, I did have a whole section of this video talking about the vision that Luke got in the cave, and while I do believe that's a boon to the story, I don't believe it's enough to save this score, because quite frankly, while I liked it and it adds to the story a lot, in terms of its flavor and feel, if we're being honest, technically speaking, that sequence isn't even really necessary. You get most of the same world building and plot without it. As a matter of fact, the characters themselves pretty much never refer to it again. It simply acts as a representation for the viewers of something that's going down in the plot itself. And you know what's funny? Aside from the whole cave thing, the whole limitation category is actually a lot worse than it was in Gurren Lagann. I know I had a field day criticizing Gurren Lagann, and I know people didn't like that, and the power system is inflated in terms of its power levels, but aside from that fact, as bad as its score was, it's still actually better than this, because the limitations, at least the ones that matter, came into play in the characters' lives far more often. And one really good thing about Gurren Lagann is the story's not so obsessed with completely downplaying the characters' abilities for the convenience of the plot. And if I'm not mistaken, that score was a 3.5. So what is this one? Quite frankly, the highest I can possibly argue for is 3. But in this case, I believe the benefit of the doubt is simply too much. As the Star Wars fan in the room, I'm telling you, the limitations don't mean anything. From the beginning of the story, the weakest character was already kinda overpowered on top of having massive amounts of plot armor. Characters fail and succeed entirely upon the whims of the writer as opposed to the actual logic in the story. So quite frankly, I think this is more deserving of a 2.5. Still not the worst I've ever seen, but hey. With my whole chest, as the guy that spent 70 minutes criticizing Naruto, I'm pretty sure that Naruto had a higher score here, I'm just saying. Even though a lot of characters have plot armor, and the rules of the system itself are so terribly inconsistent, the characters' relative limitations are far more consistent and come into play far more regularly in Naruto, at any point in Naruto, even in the war arc, than they do in the original trilogy of Star Wars. I tried really hard talking myself out of this 2.5 score, but quite frankly, I'm just not seeing it. I can't see anything higher than this. So a 2.5 it is. And averaging those 3 scores together, we have our official Magic System score. 4.83. Yeah, somebody's gonna be mad about that one. With drastically lacking governance and scarcely existent limitation, it seems the bar for the power system in Star Wars started in Hades. And before someone says it, no, arguing that it's a soft magic system is not gonna save the score. But having said that, that's all I've got for today. If you need me, you know where to find me. This is Isaiah from Magic System Monday, and I'll see you guys later.